They decided who she was long before the will was opened. In their eyes, she was only an outsider. The woman who married into the Caldwell family and then stayed too long like a winter guest, who never found the courtesy to leave when the snow melted. So when everyone gathered in the quiet law office on that Tuesday afternoon to hear the old man's final words, not a single person turned to look at her. They were still busy calculating what they would get. The sitting room of Raymond Keene's law office smelled of polished mahogany and cold tea left too long on a saucer. Cream-colored curtains hung from brass rods drawn just enough for the October light to slip through in thin bands falling across the long conference table, where the Caldwell family had arranged themselves with the precision of people who understood hierarchy without needing to discuss it. The atmosphere carried weight, not the gentle kind, but the particular stillness of a room accustomed to witnessing decisions that could never be undone. Clara Jennings sat in the last chair close to the wall, almost touching the wainscoting that had yellowed with decades of silence. She had chosen that place the moment she walked in a habit formed over 37 years of marriage into a family that never quite opened its circle wide enough to include her. Always the seat where she drew the least attention, where no one had to shift a chair or adjust a place setting to make room. Her light gray cardigan was old, the cuffs slightly frayed, where the wool had thinned from too many washings, and she rested both hands on her lap, fingers loosely laced together, trying to keep them still. The effort was small, but deliberate, the kind of self-discipline that becomes invisible to everyone except the person performing it. The others had effortlessly formed a closed orbit around the center of the table. Voices meeting one another, naturally shoulders angled inward, coffee cups passed without asking. Vivian Holt sat nearest the head, back straight, as a surveyor's rod, both hands resting on an Italian leather handbag that cost more than Clara earned in a month at the bookshop on Main Street. Vivian's dark hair was pinned in a twist that revealed pearl earrings, small, tasteful, chosen to communicate wealth without vulgarity. She was speaking softly to her son Brandon, who sat beside her scrolling through his phone with the lazy confidence of a man who had never once doubted that the world was arranged for his convenience. He was 32, broad-shouldered, wearing a sport coat that hung open as though formality was something he could take or leave. Occasionally he curled his lips into a half smile at whatever appeared on his screen, the kind of smile that included no one else in the room. Farther along the table sat Richard Caldwell Thomas's cousin, a quiet man with thinning hair and a tie knotted too tight. His wife Ellen sat beside him, her purse balanced on her knees, her eyes drifting between the window and the door, as though she had already decided this was someone else's business, and she was merely the vehicle that brought Richard here. Behind them, almost as an afterthought, two grandchildren occupied chairs near the far end. One of them, a young woman of about 24, with fair hair pulled back, simply her eyes more watchful than the occasion seemed to require. Clara noticed her, but could not immediately place the face. No one looked toward Clara, but Clara knew they knew she was there. She could feel it the way one feels a draft under a door. The awareness sliding past without acknowledgement. A presence registered and immediately filed as irrelevant. Raymond Keene stood beside the table, a man of 65 with steel-rimmed glasses and a face that had been professionally neutral for so long it had forgotten any other expression. He adjusted his spectacles, opened the thick file, and cleared his throat with the efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times and understood that the room never truly wanted to hear the words, only the numbers. His voice was low and even as he began. The last will and testament of Arthur Caldwell, executed on the 12th day of March. The legal language flowed forward and no one interrupted, though Brandon's thumb paused on his phone screen for 3 seconds before resuming its scroll. When the section concerning the division of assets began, the air inside the room shifted. Not visibly, nothing moved. But Clara felt it the way animals feel a change in barometric pressure. Something tightened in the collective breathing. Something leaned forward without anyone actually moving an inch. To my daughter, Vivian Holt. I leave the investment account at Hartford Trust, valued at the time of this writing at $420,000 to be disbursed according to the terms outlined in Appendix B. Vivian gave a slight nod. She did not smile, but her eyes brightened with the particular gleam of a woman who had expected exactly this and was pleased to have her expectations confirmed. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the clasp of her handbag, a small gesture of possession that preceded the actual possession by only seconds. To my grandson, Brandon Holt. I leave the shares in Caldwell Holdings comprising 32% of the company's outstanding equity. Brandon did not look up from his phone. He gave a soft whistle, not of surprise, but of confirmation, the sound a man makes when the check arrives, and it is precisely the amount he calculated before ordering. One of the cousins shifted in her chair. Ellen glanced at Richard, who stared straight ahead with the careful blankness of someone doing arithmetic behind his eyes. The names continued. A niece received jewelry. Richard was given a modest trust fund. Ellen's name was not mentioned, and she received this information with a single slow blink, as though she had rehearsed her indifference. The two grandchildren at the end of the table were each left small savings bonds, enough to acknowledge their existence, without suggesting they had earned a place in the old man's final thoughts. Clara sat still. She expected nothing. There was no reason to expect anything. Arthur Caldwell had been her father-in-law for 37 years, and in all that time he had never once told her she mattered, never once corrected anyone who treated her as furniture, never once intervened when Vivian's voice sharpened, or Brandon's tone dropped into the particular register of casual cruelty that passes for wit in families accustomed to money. Thomas had loved her. She was certain of that even now, 2 years after the cancer took him. But Thomas was Arthur's son, and sons in the Caldwell family expressed love the way their fathers did, which is to say, quietly, imperfectly, and almost always too late. Raymond turned to the final page. He paused for one brief beat, not dramatic, not theatrical, simply the pause of a man who knew what was coming and wanted to ensure every pair of eyes in the room had landed before he delivered it. To Clara Jennings. Brandon's thumb stopped. Vivian leaned forward by exactly 1 inch, the leather of her handbag creaking against her rings. I leave full ownership of the house at 18 Birch Hollow Road, including the landhold structures and all personal property contained within. The silence lasted exactly 1 heartbeat before it shattered. Brandon's laugh came first, sharp and unconcealed, the kind of laugh that carries no humor at all but serves as a weapon. That old house. Was he serious? He looked around the table as though waiting for others to join in, and a few did thin, uncertain laughs that died quickly in the oak-paneled air. Vivian did not laugh. Her face performed a series of rapid adjustments, surprise tightening into confusion. Confusion narrowing into something harder and more calculated. She turned to the lawyer, her voice controlled, but carrying an edge that cut cleanly through the residual chuckling. Raymond, did my father make some kind of error? There is no error, Mrs. Holt. The will has been legally validated, witnessed, and notarized. He said it the way a mason lays a brick-level plumb final. Brandon shook his head, leaned back, and let the chair tilt on its rear legs. He looked at Clara for the first time since the reading began, his gaze traveling over her worn cardigan, her sensible shoes, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Congratulations, Clara. You just inherited a pile of rotten wood and repair bills. His voice was low but clear-pitched to carry without seeming to shout, the vocal equivalent of a knife drawn slowly from a sheath. A few more laughs circled the table, louder this time, emboldened by his certainty. Clara said nothing. She gave a very slight nod as though confirming a piece of information that had arrived at the wrong address, and she was simply acknowledging receipt before returning it to the sender. But inside her chest, beneath the worn wool and the careful stillness, something had begun to move, not confidence, not even surprise exactly, but a question. A small, insistent question that pressed against the bottom of her ribcage like a stone swallowed whole. Why had Arthur Caldwell, the man who never spoke to her beyond the requirements of holiday pleasantries, left her the only thing in his estate that could not be measured in a bank statement. The reading ended quickly after that. Raymond closed the file. Chairs scraped. Voices rose in clusters, dinner plans, investment strategies, the particular busyness that people generate when they want to avoid examining what has just happened. Clara stood up last. Her knees protested slightly, a reminder from her body that 62 was no longer a number she could ignore. As she stepped into the hallway, Brandon materialized beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Something sharp and expensive that announced itself before he did. If you don't know what to do with that house. His voice barely above a murmur, the words shaped for her ears alone, my mother could buy it back. Give you a decent amount, save you a lot of trouble. Clara looked at him. Not for long, only long enough to see the face clearly. Young, smooth-jawed, tanned from a recent trip somewhere warm, radiating the absolute certainty of a man who had never stood in a grocery store aisle, calculating whether he could afford both the medicine and the bread. She felt something move in her throat, not words, something older than words, something that had been accumulating for decades of meals cooked and tables cleared, and hospital corridors walked in the middle of the night. Thank you, I can manage on my own. Her voice trembled at the edges just enough to betray her, and she hated herself for it. Hated that even now, even in this moment, her body refused to perform the calm she needed it to perform. Brandon shrugged. The gesture said everything. His mouth chose not to say that her decision was irrelevant, that the outcome was already determined, that the strong always consume the weak, and called it efficiency. He turned and walked away, his shoes clicking against the marble floor, with the rhythm of a man who owned the building and was merely passing through. Clara stood alone in the hallway for a full 10 seconds after he left. The question was still there, pressing against her ribs. Not to Vivian, who had spent her career in real estate and would know exactly how to monetize every square foot. Not to Brandon, who had already been eyeing the Birch Hollow area for development. Not to Richard or the grandchildren or the niece with the jewelry. To her, the woman in the last chair. She did not have an answer. She was not sure she deserved one. But the question followed her out of the building, through the parking lot, into the driver's seat of her 12-year-old Honda Civic, with the cracked windshield she kept meaning to fix, and all the way home to the apartment above the dry cleaners on Prospect Street, where she sat at the kitchen table for a very long time, turning the house key over in her fingers, feeling its cold weight and wondering what the old man had been trying to say. 2 days later, Clara stood in front of the house on Birch Hollow Road. The narrow path from the gate to the front door was buried under a season's worth of dry leaves, maple oak, a few papery birch leaves that caught the light like old parchment. The wooden fence leaned at an angle that suggested surrender rather than collapse, several boards already dark with rot, others simply missing, leaving gaps through which the neighbors' yards were visible. The house itself stood at the end of the path with the patient-worn dignity of something that had been forgotten but had not yet agreed to disappear. The clapboard siding was grey where it had once been white. The shutters hung at fractional angles. The roof showed patches of moss and one conspicuous gap where shingles had surrendered to a storm no one had bothered to repair. Clara stood still for a long moment at the gate, her bag over one shoulder, the key in her right hand. The October air was sharp with the smell of decomposing leaves and distant wood smoke. A crow sat on the peak of the roof, watching her with one bright eye, then lifted off with a single contemptuous flap and vanished over the tree line. She walked the path. She climbed the 2 porch steps which groaned under her weight, but held. She inserted the key, which was heavier than any key she had ever held, as though it contained the weight of the house itself compressed into brass. The lock resisted for a moment, then yielded with a dry click that echoed in the empty afternoon. When the door opened, a wave of old air rushed out to meet her wood dust mouse droppings, the faint sweetness of rotting paper, and beneath all of it something harder to name. Not foul, heavy, the particular scent of a life that had been sealed and left to settle. Inside, the darkness was thicker than she had imagined. The windows were filmed with years of grime, and the curtains, once cream, now the color of weak tea, blocked what little light the afternoon offered. Clara set her bag down on the hardwood floor, which was filmed with dust so fine it was almost invisible until her shoes disturbed it, sending tiny galaxies spiraling upward into the stale air. The living room still held its old arrangement. The sofa, shrouded in white cloth that had yellowed to the color of old bone, occupied the center of the far wall. A standing lamp with a torn shade leaned beside it like a tired sentry. The wall clock had stopped at some point in the past 10:47 morning or evening. Impossible to tell, its pendulum hanging motionless behind the glass. On the shelf beside the fireplace, a row of picture frames stood turned toward the wall, their backs facing outward like guests who had been asked to leave but refused to go entirely. Clara walked to the shelf. She reached for the nearest frame and turned it around. The photograph showed the Caldwell family at Thanksgiving. Arthur at the head of the table, Vivian beside him in a green dress. Brandon as a teenager smirking at the camera, Richard and Ellen with their daughter between them. And at the right edge, almost cropped out by the photographer's careless framing, Clara herself carrying a salad bowl, her hair still dark, her smile thin and cautious, the smile of someone who understood she was present but not included. She set the frame back on the shelf, face outward this time. She did not comment, not even to herself, but she left it facing the room. She picked up another frame, smaller, lighter. A little girl of about 6 sat on an old iron swing in the backyard, her fair hair tangled from play, her mouth open in a laugh that the camera had frozen at its widest point. Clara turned the photograph over. On the back in pencil, someone had written, "Sophie, summer 2008. Clara made apple pie." Clara held the photograph for a long time. She remembered the girl, Sophie Caldwell, Richard's daughter, the only child in the family who had ever run to Clara when she arrived, who had grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the garden, who had sat on the kitchen counter swinging her legs, while Clara rolled out pie crust and told her that the secret to good pastry was cold butter and warm patience. The girl who had once fallen asleep in Clara's lap during a thunderstorm while the rest of the family argued about money in the next room. Clara placed the photograph on the shelf, face out beside the larger one. Two pictures looking at the room now instead of hiding from it. She moved through the house slowly. Each footstep stirred the dust upward in soft plumes. She opened a window in the living room. The sash stuck, then gave way with a screech of old paint, and light poured in, revealing the thin layers of sediment on every surface, the cobweb stretching between the lamp and the mantelpiece, the water stain on the ceiling shaped like a country she could not identify. The work began without ceremony. She pulled the dust cover from the armchair and folded it. She lifted a box of old newspapers from behind the sofa and set it near the door. She opened a drawer in the sideboard, found it full of expired coupons and rubber bands that had lost their elasticity, and closed it again. There was nothing sudden, nothing dramatic, only the slow, patient labor of a woman interacting with a house that was not yet hers in any way that mattered. Not emotionally, not practically, not in the way that ownership truly means, which is less about documents than about belonging. By late afternoon, Clara sat on the front steps of the porch, drinking water from the bottle she had brought, looking out at the narrow road with no one on it. The October light had softened to amber, catching the tops of the maples that lined Birch Hollow Road and setting their remaining leaves ablaze. The house behind her no longer felt completely alien. She had touched its surfaces, breathed its air, disturbed its dust. But it was not hers either. It sat in the ambiguous territory between inheritance and home, and she did not know which direction it would eventually fall. The question Arthur had left inside her ribs had not dissolved. It had deepened. She sat on his porch in his chair, looking at his street, and felt the full absurdity of her position. A 62-year-old woman with a part-time salary of $1,600 a month, holding the deed to a house that needed a new roof, new plumbing, a new furnace, and probably a new foundation. Thomas had carried no life insurance. The cancer diagnosis had come too late for any policy to accept him, and the small savings they had built over decades had been consumed by hospital bills and the very repairs that now stared at her from every corner of this property. The numbers gathered in her mind with the relentless accuracy of someone who had spent a lifetime counting, always coming up short. Property tax alone would eat 4,000 a year. The east roof could be 8 to 12,000. The furnace was a time bomb ticking inside the basement. She thought about calling Brandon, accepting the 30,000, walking away clean. The money would cover 6 months of rent, a new pair of glasses she had been postponing for 2 years. Maybe a dental checkup she had been avoiding since Thomas died. She could be free of the Caldwell name, free of the house, free of the endless calculation of what she could and could not afford. But then she heard Thomas's voice, not the voice of his final months thin and wasted by the disease that ate him from the inside, but the voice of their middle years strong and oil-stained, and carrying the particular conviction of a man who believed in fixing things. The old house is going downhill fast. If we leave it alone, it'll turn into real trouble. He had said that every time she asked why he still brought money to Birch Hollow, instead of keeping it for their own bills. She had believed it was duty, the obligation of a son to his father's property. She had never asked what else it might be. Walking away was the thing Thomas would never have wanted. And perhaps she allowed the thought to form carefully like a match struck in wind. Perhaps it was exactly what Vivian wanted most. Clara stood up. She went back inside. She closed the door behind her. The next morning, she woke while the house was still silent. Thin silver light slipped through the old curtains in the front bedroom, spreading a pale rectangle across the warped wooden floor. She lay still for several seconds, listening to the house speak its private language, the metal stove contracting in the cold, the branches scraping lightly against the porch roof, the distant ticking of pipes in the walls, a sound like the house was breathing through old lungs. The kitchen at the end of the hallway still held its white-painted cabinets, yellowed by decades of cooking steam and neglect. Clara found an enamel kettle in the corner, rinsed it under the tap. The water ran weakly and unevenly, sputtering brown for 3 seconds before clearing, and set it on the stove. The burner caught on the third try. She made tea with the bags she had brought from home, standing at the window, looking out at the backyard. The yard was overgrown, but not wild. Crabgrass and goldenrod had taken the lawn. A rusted wheelbarrow sat on its side near the fence. And in the center of the yard, the old iron swing hung from its frame chains, orange with oxidation. The wooden seat split down the middle. Sophie's swing. Beyond it, at the far edge of the property, near the stone wall that marked the boundary with the Prescott lot, stood the maple tree. It was enormous now, 60 feet at least. Its canopy spreading wide enough to shade half the yard, its leaves turning from green to gold, to the deep arterial red of late October. Eleanor Caldwell had planted that tree the year she and Arthur moved in. Clara had never met Eleanor. The woman died 15 years before Clara married Thomas, but she had tended the tree for a decade, watering it during summer droughts, clearing the deadfall from its base each spring, because it seemed like the kind of thing a house needed, something alive and growing to anchor it to the earth. After the simple breakfast, Clara moved to the dining room. The low cabinet against the wall held a row of porcelain plates with blue floral patterns, a few chipped at the rim, where someone had stacked them carelessly. In the drawers, she found folded tablecloths pressed flat by years of weight, tarnished silver spoons with the Caldwell monogram grocery receipts from a decade earlier, and a stack of Christmas cards bound with a faded silver ribbon. She untied the ribbon and fanned the cards across the table. Every envelope bore the name of a Caldwell. Not a single card was addressed to Clara. She retied the ribbon. She placed the cards back in the drawer. She continued cleaning. By midday, the room felt lighter, as though the dust had been a kind of grief, and its removal was a kind of permission. The sound of a car stopping in front of the yard lifted her head. Through the window frame between the unwashed panes, Clara saw the pearl-colored Mercedes. Vivian did not turn off the engine. Immediately, she sat behind the wheel for a full 30 seconds, studying the house through the windshield, with the appraising eye of a woman who had spent her career in real estate evaluating properties and had already assigned this one a number. Then the door opened, and Vivian stepped out her heels, finding the dry patches along the damp path with practiced efficiency. Vivian stood in the doorway without fully entering. Her gaze moved through the hallway, the stairs, the pile of dusty cloths Clara had brought down, the broom, leaning against the wall, cataloging everything with the efficiency of an inventory. Clara opened the door wider. "Come in." "No need." Vivian's eyes continued their sweep. "This place is too cold and damp." She adjusted the thin gloves on her hands, a gesture that communicated her intention to touch nothing. "Raymond sent me copies of the paperwork this morning. Are you really planning to keep this house?" "Yes." Vivian's mouth tightened by a fraction of an inch. Not quite a frown, not quite a smile, but the particular expression of a woman who has encountered an obstacle she considers temporary. "Don't be stubborn." Her voice stayed light, conversational, the tone of someone discussing whether to take an umbrella. "This house swallows repair money faster than anything you can imagine. Property taxes, the roof, the plumbing, the stove, not to mention every miscellaneous thing inside. You can't carry that." Clara rested her hand against the doorframe. "I haven't said I need anyone to carry it for me." Vivian let out a short breath through her nose. "Brandon is looking at this area for a weekend property. If you agree to sell it back to the family, everything becomes simpler. I can pay you $30,000 cash, quick and clean. $30,000. Clara turned the number over in her mind. It was enough to pay a few bills, cover a few months. But it was a fraction, an insult of a fraction of what the land on Birch Hollow was worth. And Clara knew this even though she had never dealt in real estate, because she had lived her entire adult life performing the arithmetic of insufficiency, and she could smell a discounted price the way a butcher smells meat turning. "No." Vivian blinked. She recovered quickly, her features resetting to their default position of pleasant authority. "You should think carefully. Thomas is gone. No one expects you to struggle like this on your own." Clara looked straight at her. And for one moment, the 37 years between them compressed into a single point of focus every Thanksgiving Clara had cooked, while Vivian supervised from the living room every Christmas, where Clara washed dishes while Vivian opened gifts every hospital night, where Clara sat in the corridor while Vivian sent flowers and did not come. "It's because Thomas is gone that I have to think carefully." Vivian's face hardened. The pleasantness drained away, replaced by something older. Something that had been waiting beneath the surface for years. "You always know how to make things awkward. Maybe because everyone is used to letting me take the awkward part for them." They stood facing each other across the threshold. Vivian on the path, Clara in the doorway. The house behind Clara like a second body. Outside, the wind moved through the dry maples, making a sound like paper being slowly crumpled. Vivian pulled the strap of her handbag onto her shoulder. Then she delivered the line she had been saving. Her voice dropped, the sweetness gone, entirely replaced by something thin and sharp as a blade slid between ribs. "You think my father left you this house because he cared about you? He was bitter at the end. Bitter at me, bitter at the family. You were his way of punishing us. Don't confuse an old man's spite with affection, Clara. You'll only embarrass yourself." The words hit Clara in the center of her chest. Not because they were cruel, she had survived cruelty from this family, the way one survives weather, by enduring it until it passed. But because the words touched the exact fear she had been carrying since the reading of the will. The fear she had not spoken aloud, had barely allowed herself to think. What if Vivian was right? What if Arthur's gift was not recognition but revenge? What if she was not the person he valued, but merely the weapon he chose? Vivian turned away first. "When you change your mind, call us before this house collapses on your head." Clara closed the door. She did not go back to the dining room immediately. She leaned against the door, the wood cold against her shoulder blades, the paint rough through her cardigan, and closed her eyes. She breathed. The house breathed with her. Its old timbers contracting in the October chill, its windows rattling softly in their frames. Vivian's words circulated inside her like a slow poison. Arthur's spite, Arthur's punishment. Clara as a means, not an end. She tried to push the thought away and found that she could not because the thought had roots it connected to every meal served without thanks, every holiday endured without welcome, every year she had given to a family that treated her presence as a clerical error. Then she pushed herself off the door, picked up the cleaning cloth from the dining room table, and continued. Not because she had resolved the question, not because Vivian's words had lost their sting, but because the dining room was still dusty, and the cabinet still needed wiping, and there was no one else in the world who was going to do it. In the afternoon, she moved to the small study at the end of the hallway. The room smelled of old paper and dry ink, the particular museum scent of knowledge that has been sealed away from circulation for too long. On the desk sat a green-shaded banker's lamp, a walnut pen holder with 3 fountain pens arranged by size and 3 drawers locked with small brass mechanisms that had not been turned in years. Clara found a hairpin in her coat pocket that served after more than 10 minutes of patient manipulation to spring open the first drawer. Inside were family files tied neatly with cotton string, insurance papers, tax returns from the 1990s, bank correspondence on letterhead from institutions that had since been absorbed by larger banks, repair receipts organized by year. The second drawer contained photographs, most of them black and white, their edges curling. Arthur, as a young man, lean, dark-haired, handsome, in the way that men of his generation were handsome, which is to say, unaware of it. Vivian as a child of perhaps 8 or 9, her hair in 2 thick braids standing on the front porch of this very house beside her father, her arm linked through his, both of them squinting into summer sunlight. The easy intimacy of the pose surprised Clara. She had never imagined Vivian as a child who clung to her father's arm. Below that, a photograph of Arthur and Eleanor on the same porch. Eleanor standing behind the rocking chair with one hand on Arthur's shoulder. The maple tree behind them still short, its leaves brilliant red against the white clapboard. They looked like people who believed in the permanence of things. And then Thomas. Thomas standing beside a battered pickup truck in front of the newly opened garage on Wheeler Road, grease on his hands. A grin splitting his face, young and strong, and utterly certain that hard work was enough. Clara touched the photograph with one fingertip, tracing the line of his jaw, and felt the grief that she kept locked in a compartment behind her sternum shift and press outward like water against a dam. The third drawer was heavier. When she pulled it open, the wood groaned against the runners, and she saw what Arthur had left for her to find. Several leather-bound journals stacked neatly along the left side, and resting on top of them, placed with deliberate precision, a cream-colored envelope. On its face, in Arthur Caldwell's square, firm handwriting, the handwriting of a man who had been taught penmanship as a moral discipline, 3 words, for Clara. She stood still at the desk for a very long time. One hand rested on the edge of the drawer, the other hung at her side, fingers slightly curled, as though preparing to receive something she was not certain she wanted to hold. Outside the window, the afternoon sunlight had slanted down across the tree line behind the house, turning the maples into columns of fire. The clock in the living room, the one that had stopped at 10:47, suddenly gave a short dry sound, a single mechanical hiccup, and then fell silent again, as though the house itself had startled. Clara picked up the envelope. She did not open it immediately. She carried it to the desk, sat down in the wooden chair, and held it in both hands, feeling the weight of the paper, the texture of the envelope, the slight roughness where the glue had aged. Then she carefully separated the yellowed edge. Inside was a letter written on heavy stationery, dark blue ink, the handwriting straight and deliberate. Clara began to read, and the room around her, the dust, the shelves, the lamp, the fading light receded until there was nothing left but the words and the silence they occupied. Clara, if you are reading this letter, it means I have gone ahead by one step, and this house now belongs to you. I do not expect you to be any less surprised than the others. I do not expect them to understand my decision either. They have never looked long enough to understand anything. She read each line slowly, the way one reads a document that might detonate. For 37 years I have seen who came into this house the first winter with shoes soaked through from the snow and both hands holding a tray of cakes, because she was afraid that arriving empty-handed would be considered impolite. I have seen who woke earliest on every holiday to light the stove, set the table, warm the food, and was the last person to stand up and clean when the others had already gone home. I have seen who quietly brought medicine for Thomas, took me to my appointments, mended the sleeve of my coat before anyone noticed it was torn. I know all of it. Clara stopped reading. The hand holding the letter tightened slightly, making the edge of the paper tremble. She realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to exhale. I also know other things. I know Vivian never considered you family. I know Brandon learned to speak to people beneath him from a very young age and no one corrected it. I know Thomas loved you, but he was too much like his father. He believed silence was a way to keep peace under a roof. He was wrong about that. I was wrong too. I have grown old in this house, and I have witnessed too many things. People think property is what measures the value of a family. They are wrong. A family is measured by how they treat the weakest person in the house, the one with the least voice, the one who remains when everyone else has already stepped outside. So this house is not for the person who carries the Caldwell name as a matter of course. It is for the person who preserved the last decent part of this family without needing anyone to see it. That person is you. Then she reached the final section, and the letter changed from elegy to instruction. 5 years ago, I tried to transfer co-ownership of this house to Thomas. Vivian found out. She came to the house and told me I was creating division in the family, that I was favoring my daughter-in-law over my own daughter. I understand Vivian's pain. After Eleanor died, she felt I grew distant from her and closer to you. Perhaps she was right about that. But closeness does not come from blood. It comes from who shows up. I was old. I did not have the strength to fight my own daughter. I gave in. That was the greatest mistake of my life. But I did not surrender entirely. I wrote this will through Raymond, not through the family. I also promised Eleanor before she died that this house would go to the right person. Now I am keeping that promise. If you want to know the truth, look in the third drawer of the file cabinet behind the desk beneath the false bottom. Clara set the letter down with both hands flat on the desk, pressing the paper against the wood as though pinning it to reality. The afternoon light had retreated from the window, leaving the study in gray half-shadow. Vivian's voice echoed inside her. You think my father left you this house because he cared about you. And now, laid against Arthur's words, the echo took on a different quality. Not the sound of truth revealed, but the sound of a daughter who had felt herself replaced and could not bear to admit it. Clara did not know if she felt sympathy for Vivian. What she felt was something more complicated, the particular vertigo of a person who has spent a lifetime believing she was invisible, only to discover that someone had been watching the entire time and keeping notes. She walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch. The maple tree, Eleanor's maple, stood enormous against the darkening sky, its leaves catching the last copper light of the day. Clara had watered that tree for 10 years, had raked its leaves every autumn, had watched it grow from the window of the kitchen while she washed dishes that were never hers. She stood on the porch and allowed herself to cry. Not the polite, contained crying of a woman who has learned to grieve quietly so as not to inconvenience anyone, but the real kind, the kind that comes from the deepest floor of a person, where the sediment of decades of silence has settled into a layer so thick it takes an earthquake to disturb it. She cried because Arthur had seen her, because Thomas had fought for her in ways she never knew, because Eleanor, a woman she had never met, had asked her husband to protect the person who would care for her tree. But even as she cried, Vivian's words were still there. The old man's spite, the old man's punishment, Clara's weapon. And she knew that until she opened the third drawer of the file cabinet and found what Arthur had hidden beneath the false bottom, she would not know which version of the truth was real. The love or the revenge, the recognition or the reckoning. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her cardigan. She looked at the tree one more time. Then she went back inside and closed the door behind her, leaving the question for tomorrow, where it would wait for her. the way the house had waited, patient, heavy, and full of things that had been buried for far too long. She knelt before the file cabinet at 7 the next morning, while the house was still cold, and the light through the study window was the color of pewter. The third drawer resisted swollen wood against old metal runners, and Clara had to brace one hand against the cabinet's side and pull with the other until it surrendered with a groan that vibrated through the floorboards. Inside were a few stacks of yellowed paper, a bundle of cancelled checks held together with a rubber band that had fused to itself and nothing else. The drawer appeared ordinary, ordinary enough that anyone searching in haste would have closed it and moved on. Clara removed the papers, carefully setting each stack on the desk behind her. When the drawer was empty, she ran her fingers along the bottom, feeling for the seam Arthur had mentioned. Her nail caught it at the rear left corner, a hairline gap between the plywood bottom and the drawer's frame. She worked the tip of her fingernail into the gap, prying upward. The false bottom lifted with surprising ease a thin panel of wood, no thicker than a playing card, and beneath it lay a bundle of documents tied with cloth string, and a small brass key that gleamed dully against the raw wood. She brought everything to the desk. Her hands were steady, but her pulse was not. She untied the string with the deliberate care of a woman diffusing something and spread the contents across the green leather blotter. The first file was a stack of land tax payment receipts spanning 12 years from a decade earlier, all the way back to the year Thomas first fell ill. Each receipt bore the same payer name, Thomas Jennings. Not Arthur Caldwell, not Vivian Holt, not any other member of the family whose name hung on the mailbox. Clara recognized the forms. She had signed some of these checks herself at the kitchen table on Prospect Street, writing the amount in her careful hand, while Thomas leaned over her shoulder, smelling of engine grease and black coffee. She knew they had paid the taxes. What she had not known, what stopped her breath now, was that Arthur had kept copies. Every single receipt arranged chronologically, each one marked in the upper right corner with a small red dot made by a felt-tip pen. The dots were precise, deliberate, the marks of a man building a case he hoped he would never have to argue. The second file held contracts and invoices. Roof repair, the east side where the shingles had been peeling since before Thomas's diagnosis. Pipe replacement, the upstairs bathroom where the water had run brown every winter. Heating system overhaul, basement damp proofing. Half the invoices were stamped, paid in full, and beneath each stamp was a check number traced back to the joint account Clara and Thomas had shared at the Savings Bank of Connecticut. Thomas's signature appeared on every check, the letters strong, but tilted slightly to the right, as though he had always been in a hurry to finish writing and get back to working with his hands. And besides several of his signatures in smaller, neater handwriting, Clara's own countersignature. The third file stopped her entirely. It was a manila envelope from a law office in New Haven, Garrett, and Howe Attorneys at Law, an address on Chapel Street. Inside was a copy of an agreement dated 5 years earlier. The language was dense, but the substance was clear. Arthur Caldwell had intended to transfer co-ownership of the house at 18 Birch Hollow Road to his son Thomas Jennings, in exchange for Thomas assuming full responsibility for maintenance, upkeep, and Arthur's personal care until the end of his life. The agreement had been drafted, reviewed, and prepared for filing. It had never been filed. In the margin, Arthur's handwriting, smaller now, cramped the penmanship of a man writing in anger or grief, or both. Vivian objected. She said I was showing favoritism, that I was handing over the family's property to my daughter-in-law through Thomas. She came to the house when I had just been discharged from the hospital after the pneumonia. June Prescott was there. She witnessed everything. Vivian brought power of attorney papers and wanted me to sign them. June told me not to sign. I refused. But I gave in on the transfer. That was the worst mistake I ever made. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that had regained its steadiness, if Thomas dies before completion, this interest transfers intact to Clara. Clara pushed back from the desk. She stood, her hands flat on the desk surface, arms locked, weight forward, the posture of a person bracing against a wave they can see coming, but cannot outrun. The anger arrived before she was ready for it. It came not as heat but as clarity, the sudden terrible sharpness of seeing a familiar landscape lit by lightning, every feature revealed in merciless detail. Thomas had known about this agreement. Thomas had negotiated it, signed it, brought it to the lawyers in New Haven. And Thomas had never told her. Not once in all the evenings he came home late from Birch Hollow, with plaster dust in his hair and paint under his nails, had he mentioned that he was fighting for their right to this house. Not once in all the nights they sat at the kitchen table, calculating how to cover the next invoice, had he said the words that would have changed everything. He had protected her the way Arthur had protected her, silently, unilaterally, without permission. The two men she had loved most in the world had conspired to save her, and neither of them had thought to ask if she wanted to be saved, or how, or whether she might have preferred to stand beside them in the fight, instead of learning about it after both of them were in the ground. Clara walked out of the study, through the hallway, past the living room, and onto the front porch. The morning air was raw. Frost had silvered the railings overnight, and the wooden boards were slick under her shoes. She gripped the porch railing with both hands and stood there, breathing her breath, making small white ghosts that dissolved into the gray Connecticut morning. She was angry at Thomas. The anger surprised her with its specificity, not the generalized grief she had carried for 2 years, but a pointed, narrow fury aimed at the man who had funneled the equivalent of her soul bracelet and overtime wages into repairs, and said it was just a few roof tiles, just a few sections of pipe. She was angry at Arthur for surrendering to Vivian when he had the power and the proof to resist. And she was angry at herself. A deeper anger, the kind that lives in the marrow, for accepting the role of silence for so long that it had become indistinguishable from her identity. For a full minute she considered leaving. Walking down the porch steps, getting in her car, driving back to the apartment on Prospect Street, and never returning. Let Vivian have the house. Let Brandon develop the land. The $30,000 would buy 6 months of peace, and peace, after 37 years of war, conducted in whispers, seemed like a bargain at any price. Then the knock came. Not Vivian's knock, heavy, proprietary. This knock was lighter, slower, evenly spaced. The knock of someone who remembered which board on the porch squeaked and had stepped around it out of old habit. Clara opened the door. June Prescott stood on the porch wearing a blue knitted shawl over a flannel shirt. Her silver hair pinned up in the efficient twist of a woman who had spent 40 years as a registered nurse and still dressed as though she might be called to a patient at any moment. In her hands, she held a plate of oatmeal cookies covered with a checkered cloth, and her face, weathered, kind, shrewd, carried the particular expression of someone who has been debating with herself about whether to intrude and has finally decided that the situation requires intrusion. Sorry to come by without calling. Her voice was clear and unhurried, the voice of a woman accustomed to delivering difficult news in calm tones. I saw your car here since yesterday. Thought maybe you could use something warmer than tea bags. Clara took the plate and stepped aside. June entered the kitchen the way a river enters a familiar channel, without hesitation, without looking around her body, remembering the dimensions of the room. Clara poured tea into 2 mismatched cups and set one in front of June. Did you know he left me this house? June wrapped both hands around the cup. I didn't know the details, but I knew he'd been thinking about it a long time. She took a sip, set the cup down, and looked at Clara with the direct gaze of a woman who had spent her life making assessments. I was close with Eleanor, Arthur's wife, for more than 40 years. I was her nurse the last months. Before she died, she told Arthur something I wasn't supposed to hear. But I was changing her IV and the room was small. She said, keep the house for the right person. Don't let Vivian sell it and put up condominiums. Arthur promised her. He held her hand and promised. Clara sat very still. June continued, her voice dropping into the lower register she reserved for facts that mattered. About 3 years ago, Vivian came to visit Arthur right after he got out of the hospital, that bad pneumonia, the one that nearly killed him. I was here helping him get settled. Vivian walked in with a folder full of papers, power of attorney documents. She wanted Arthur to sign over management of all his real estate holdings to her. He was weak, barely out of the oxygen, still shaking when he stood. He picked up the pen. I was standing right there, refilling his water glass, and something in me just couldn't stay quiet. Arthur, don't sign anything until you're well enough to read every word. That's what I told him. The look Vivian gave me could have stripped paint off a car hood. She left within 5 minutes. June set her teacup down and folded her hands on the table. I'm telling you this so you understand something. Vivian didn't just stand in the way of the transfer. She actively tried to take control while her father was at his weakest. There's a difference between blocking a door and trying to change the locks. Clara looked down at her tea. The surface trembled slightly. June looked toward the half-open study door. Arthur told me once that houses don't fall apart because of storms. They fall apart from the inside when people stop holding each other up. He was more afraid of that than of getting old. June paused, then softened her voice to something structural like the last beam that keeps the roof from caving. I know Vivian told you Arthur left you the house out of spite. She called me yesterday and asked me to talk sense into you. Her exact words. She told me her father was bitter at the end and used you to punish the family. June held Clara's gaze. Arthur Caldwell was a lot of things. Stubborn, private, terrible at showing affection. But he was not spiteful. He kept a promise he made to his dying wife. That's not revenge. That's just a man keeping his word when no one was watching. June stood after nearly an hour when the light through the kitchen window had shifted from gray to pale gold. At the door, she stopped and turned back. If you're planning to stay, don't let Vivian frighten you. Arthur didn't leave you this house so you could sell it for a fraction of what it's worth. Clara walked her to the gate. When she came back inside, the kitchen felt different, not warmer exactly, but inhabited, as though June's presence had reminded the house that it was built to contain human voices, and not just the sounds of settling wood and dripping faucets. The anger had not disappeared. But it had been joined by something else, not quite certainty, not quite peace, but the particular steadiness that comes from learning that a version of events you feared was true, has been contradicted by a witness with no reason to lie. That night, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the front bedroom listening to the wind testing the windows, the branches scraping the porch roof, the old pipes groaning inside the walls. At 11, she gave up and turned on the bedside lamp, a ceramic thing, with a cracked shade that threw a circle of yellow light across the quilt. She reached for the stack of Thomas's letters she had brought from the study. Most were written on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook, the handwriting familiar and aching. Thomas's hand, the hand that had rebuilt carburetors and held her face and signed checks for a roof that was not his own. She chose the letter that felt heaviest. Dad, I know you think I'm overdoing it. The back roof, the pipes, the basement. But if this place keeps going downhill, nobody's going to be able to save it later. I'm not doing this for the land. I'm doing it because this is home. Clara's throat tightened. She could hear his voice in the letters. The flat Connecticut vowels, the careful grammar of a man who had not gone to college, but refused to sound like he hadn't. Clara thinks so too. She doesn't say much because she doesn't want to make things difficult between you and Vivian. But most of the repair money comes from what she scraped together over time at the bookshop, her own savings. I want you to know that. The next paragraph was the one that broke something open inside her. I gave Clara's expense notebook to you last month. Keep it, Dad. Keep it somewhere safe. If there ever comes a day when somebody needs proof that she's not an outsider, that she paid for this family with money. She didn't have that notebook, is it? She doesn't know I took it. She'd be embarrassed. But you need to see what she gave up so this roof wouldn't leak through one more winter. Clara set the letter flat on the quilt and pressed both palms against it, as though holding down something alive. Thomas had taken her notebook, the small blue-covered book where she recorded every dollar, every sacrifice, every postponement, and given it to Arthur without telling her. He had opened the most private ledger of her life and handed it to a man she had never been certain even knew her name. And he had done it out of love, the particular infuriating, heartbreaking love of a man who believed that protecting someone meant making decisions for them. She reached for the last letter in the stack. Shorter. The handwriting less steady. This one had been written from the hospital, she could tell by the institutional blue of the paper, and the way the lines wavered, as though the hand that wrote them had been recently disconnected from an IV. If there comes a day when I no longer have the strength to take care of it, please don't let what Clara and I have done come to nothing. Clara has never asked anything from this family, but that does not mean she doesn't deserve to keep some part of it. If you still believe family is something worth preserving, then remember the person who preserved it through the quietest work. Clara folded the letter and held it against her chest. She felt the full weight of what Thomas had done, not just the repairs, not just the money, but the secret campaign he had waged on her behalf, arguing her case to a man who had spent 80 years building walls around his own emotions. Thomas had done what she had never been able to do for herself. He had insisted that she mattered, and he had done it without ever telling her, which meant that for the last 2 years she had grieved him as a kind, quiet, imperfect husband. And now she had to grieve him again as something more complicated. A man who loved her fiercely but silently. A man who believed in her value but never trusted her with the knowledge of his belief. She could not decide if this made her love him more or less. She suspected the answer was both, and that this particular kind of love, the kind that includes anger and gratitude and sorrow in equal, inseparable measure, was the only kind that was real. She picked up the small blue notebook from the bedside table. Her own handwriting stared back at her from the pages, neat, cramped, the penmanship of a woman who had learned to make every inch of paper count. Postpone new glasses, $240. Postpone dental checkup, $180. Sell gold bracelet, $650. Request extra evening shift Tuesday and Thursday. The gold bracelet. Her mother's bracelet. The only thing Ruth Jennings had left her daughter, besides a recipe for cornbread and the habit of rising before dawn. Clara had sold it at a pawn shop in Waterbury during the winter. Thomas's hospital bills arrived in the same week as the invoice for Arthur's pipe replacement. Thomas never asked why she stopped wearing it. She never explained. Tucked into the middle of the notebook between a grocery list and a record of gasoline expenses was a slip of paper she had not written. The handwriting was Arthur's, square, steady, unmistakable. 4 words. Clara, don't stay silent anymore. She held the notebook in one hand and her phone in the other. The screen glowed with the contact list. Brandon Holtz, number 3, swipes away. $1,600 a month against $4,000 in annual taxes, against a roof that could go any winter, against a furnace that wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. The math was merciless. The math was always merciless. Her thumb hovered over the screen. One call, one signature, one drive back to Prospect Street. She could be free of all of it. Free in the way that surrender is free, which is to say, not free at all, but merely finished. Arthur's 4 words lay in her lap, written in ink that had dried years ago by a hand that was now dust. Clara put the phone on the nightstand screen down and turned off the lamp. She lay in the dark listening to the house settle, and she understood something that had been approaching her for days, but had only now arrived close enough to name. If she sold the house, she would be choosing silence one final time, and this time it would be permanent, because there would be no one left to ask her to speak. Arthur had asked. Thomas had asked. The notebook with its 4 handwritten words was the last request she would ever receive from either of them. She would not sell. The next evening, the phone in the kitchen rang while Clara was washing the study windows. She dried her hands on her jeans and picked up the receiver on the 3rd ring. Raymond Keene's voice came through the line with controlled precision. Mrs. Jennings, I apologize for calling late. There are a few things I believe you should know before you hear them from someone else. He paused, not for drama, but for the particular caution of a lawyer who understands that information once delivered cannot be retrieved. This morning, Brandon Holt submitted a formal offer through my office to purchase the house on behalf of the family. The stated reason is preservation of the family property. The offered price is significantly below market value. Clara rested her free hand on the kitchen table. How far below? I'd rather not put a number on the gap until I've finished checking. But there's something more important. Brandon hired a land assessment firm last week. The Birch Hollow area is included in the town's expansion plan, new access road residential development zone on the north side. The actual value of your parcel is 8 to 10 times what they're offering. Clara absorbed this quickly, precisely the arithmetic running behind her eyes. The family is also proposing a dinner this Sunday at Birch Hollow, ostensibly to remember Arthur and discuss things peacefully. Clara looked through the kitchen window. Full dark. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, a woman alone in a lit room surrounded by darkness on every side. If you refuse, they'll say you're cutting off the family. If you agree, at least everything happens on floors that belong to you. If they want to come, let them come. Raymond's voice dropped half a register. I'll be there if you need me. After hanging up, Clara returned to the sitting room. She gathered the documents from the desk. Arthur's letter, Thomas's letters, the tax receipts, the repair invoices, the unfinished transfer agreement, the blue notebook, and arranged them in a low wooden tray she had found in the dining room cabinet. She placed the tray on the dining table beside the empty vase. She looked at the arrangement for a long time. It resembled evidence, which she supposed it was. But it was also something else. It was a table set not for serving, but for speaking. And for the first time in her life, Clara Jennings was preparing to sit at the head. Saturday night. The house was quiet except for the furnace cycling in the basement, a deep, unsteady rumble. Clara stood in the bathroom, the overhead bulb casting sharp shadows beneath her cheekbones, and looked at herself in the mirror. The face that looked back was 62 years old and did not apologize for it. Lines around the mouth from decades of holding words behind her teeth. Deeper lines around the eyes from squinting at price tags and bank statements and the fine print on medical bills. Gray hair honest and unadorned. She rested both hands on the edge of the sink and leaned forward until her forehead nearly touched the glass. Tomorrow, Vivian would sit at the table with her leather handbag and her real estate arithmetic. Brandon would arrive with his developer's eye and his assumption that every problem could be solved by writing a check smaller than the one the problem deserved. And Clara would sit at the table with a wooden tray full of documents and 37 years of unspoken words pressing against the back of her teeth. Tomorrow no one speaks for me. The words were barely audible, meant for no one but the woman in the glass and the house that held her. She turned off the light and went to bed. Sunday arrived with a sky the color of old pewter and a wind that moved through the front yard in long deliberate gusts, pulling the last yellow leaves from the maples and scattering them across the brick path like invitations no one had sent. Clara woke at 5:30 before the light before the furnace kicked on, before the house had begun its morning vocabulary of creaks and settling wood. She lay in the dark for precisely 1 minute, counting the way she had counted everything in her life, then pushed back the quilt and put her feet on the cold floor. She dressed simply. The dark blue knit dress she had owned for 9 years, hemmed twice, washed until the fabric had achieved the particular softness of clothing that has outlasted the occasions it was purchased for. She tied her hair at the nape of her neck. No pins, no fuss. In the kitchen, she made coffee, standing at the window, while the percolator worked, watching the backyard emerge from darkness, the fence first, then the rusted swing frame, then Eleanor's maple, its bare upper branches reaching into the gray sky like the fingers of a hand trying to hold something that had already fallen. At 8 o'clock, she set the dining table. Not the way she had set it for 37 years of Caldwell holidays. Silverware, aligned napkins, folded water glasses filled before anyone arrived. Everything arranged for the comfort of people who would never notice the labor. This time she placed the wooden tray at the center, directly beside the uncut cake June Prescott had sent over at dawn with a note that read, simply, "You won't need luck." She positioned Arthur's letter on the left, Thomas's letters on the right. The invoices and tax receipts in the center, the blue notebook at the front, and the transfer agreement on top where it could not be missed. Then she set out plates, cups, and utensils for 12 methodically without sentiment, the way a general marks positions on a map before battle. The first car appeared outside the gate at 11:45. Vivian's Mercedes, freshly washed. Vivian stepped out carrying a box of bakery pastries from a Hartford patisserie, an expensive performative gesture, the edible equivalent of arriving at a funeral in couture. Brandon followed 3 steps behind, sport coat open, despite the cold phone already in hand, his gaze sweeping the property with the measuring focus of a man who sees acreage where other people see trees. They entered without knocking. Vivian set the pastry box on the kitchen counter, glanced at the dining table with its wooden tray of documents, and her eyes narrowed by exactly 1 millimeter. A reaction she corrected so quickly that anyone not watching for it would have missed it. Richard and Ellen arrived next. Richard carrying a bottle of wine he clearly wished he could drink right now. Sophie Caldwell came through the door behind her parents wearing a plain sweater and jeans. And when she saw Clara standing by the dining room entrance, she met her eyes and held them for a full beat longer than anyone else had bothered to in years. The nod she gave was small but deliberate, a private signal transmitted across the room's geography of alliance and indifference. Raymond Keene was last. He came through the door carrying only a leather briefcase, shook Clara's hand with restrained pressure, and settled into a chair at the far end of the table. His presence altered the room's chemistry, the way a referee alters a boxing ring. The fighters were still in their corners, but the rules had arrived. Clara served the meal. Reheated soup, baked bread, cold cuts, cheese, pickles, June's oatmeal cake. She did not make many dishes. Every person at the table understood, whether they admitted it or not, that the food was secondary to whatever was waiting in the wooden tray at the center of the tablecloth. The early conversation performed its usual function: weather, traffic, the sale of a property on the south side of town that Brandon analyzed with reflexive authority. Forks clinked against porcelain. Wine was poured. The radiator in the corner ticked as the old furnace pushed heat through pipes that protested the effort. Brandon was the first to steer toward purpose. He set down his knife and looked around the table with casual authority. I took a quick look at the land behind the house. If the entrance road is redone and those old bushes cleared out, this place could appreciate fast. Very fast. Vivian set down her fork with surgical precision. Actually, the family came today partly because we'd like to settle the matter smoothly. Keeping this house alone is too heavy a burden for you, Clara. The sweetness in her voice was architectural load-bearing, designed to support the weight of what she intended to build on top of it. I'm living here. Clara's voice was level, unadorned, 3 words arranged like bricks. That's exactly what concerns me. Vivian leaned forward. You're used to a small apartment near your work. Easy to manage. This house is old, isolated, and needs constant maintenance. Someone in your situation shouldn't tie herself to a place like this. A granddaughter near the window nodded along the reflexive agreement of someone who has learned that siding with Vivian is the safest position in any room. Brandon wiped his mouth with the cloth napkin. I already had a lawyer prepare an offer. The family buys it back privately. No price pressure, no complications. You just sign. My mother even said she'd let you take some keepsakes. The word keepsakes landed on the table with the soft thud of an insult wrapped in tissue paper. She set down her spoon. I'm not selling. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the pressurized silence of a room full of people who have been told something they did not expect and are rapidly recalculating their positions. Clara stood. She walked to the cabinet, lifted the wooden tray, and carried it to the center of the table, setting it down beside the uncut cake, with the care of a woman placing evidence before a jury. I used to think the way you do. Her voice was steady-pitched just above the threshold of the room's ambient noise, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Until I read what Arthur left behind. Vivian's frown deepened. Raymond. There's nothing in the will beyond ownership of the house. The things Mrs. Jennings found in the house belonged to her, Mrs. Holt. Raymond's voice carried the unhurried weight of a man who has spent 40 years letting the law speak for itself. Clara took Arthur's letter from the tray. She did not pass it around the table. She simply opened it, looked down at the page, and began to read aloud. Her voice was not theatrical. It did not rise or fall with practiced emotion. It was the voice of a woman reading words that were not hers, but had been written for her, and the restraint of that voice, its refusal to perform, was more devastating than any dramatic reading could have been. She read about the 37 years, the wet shoes, the tray of cakes, the holiday mornings, the medicine and the appointments, and the mended coat sleeve. Each sentence fell onto the dining table with the specific gravity of something that had been buried too long and was now being unearthed in front of the people who had buried it. Vivian sat rigid, her spine a vertical line, her hands motionless on the tablecloth. Brandon's upper lip curled in the preliminary architecture of a smirk. But the smirk could not find enough material to complete itself, and his face settled instead into a tight, uncomfortable blankness. Clara continued. Arthur's words about Vivian's refusal to accept her, about Brandon's inherited condescension, about Thomas's fatal belief that silence was protection, about the meaning of family measured not by name, but by who stayed when staying cost everything. She set the letter down and opened Thomas's bundle. She chose the shortest letter, the one from the hospital, and read the passage about repair money scraped together from overtime and personal savings. Then she spread the invoices across the table, fanning them out like a hand of cards. 12 years of tax receipts, roof contracts, pipe replacements, furnace repairs, each one bearing Thomas's signature, or the joint account number, each one stamped with the evidence of labor that the family had never known or had known and chosen to forget. For years, everyone said I lived only by depending on my husband. Clara's voice gained an edge, not anger exactly, but the precision of a blade being drawn across a whetstone. But it was Thomas and I who kept this house from falling apart. We did that while no one in this family wanted to pay a single dollar. Vivian's response came faster than expected and harder. She had been preparing for this. Perhaps not this exact scenario, but for the general possibility of resistance, and her counterattack was fluent and rehearsed. Those are a few repair bills. They don't change the fundamental nature of family property. My father's cognitive abilities were declining in his final years. Any competent attorney could argue this will was drafted under diminished capacity. The room contracted. Clara felt the air tighten around the table as the word capacity landed heavy, technical, aimed with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much damage a legal term could do when deployed at the right moment. Raymond set down his water glass. The will was executed in the presence of two independent witnesses and accompanied by a physician's certification of Mr. Caldwell's cognitive competence at the time of signing. I prepared for that possibility, Mrs. Holt. Vivian pivoted toward him, her eyes sharpening to points. You prepared. Are you my family's lawyer or hers? I am the lawyer of the person who wrote the will. The sentence was a wall-flat solid and built to absorb impact without cracking. Clara reached into the tray and slid the unfinished transfer agreement across the table toward Vivian. Arthur intended to transfer this house to Thomas 5 years ago, but someone objected. She held Vivian's gaze without blinking. His letter names who. And there's a witness to the day you brought power of attorney papers to this house while he was recovering from pneumonia. The color left Vivian's face in stages, first the cheeks, then the forehead, then the thin skin around her temples, as though the blood itself was retreating from the implications. She stood so abruptly that her chair rocked backward on two legs before settling. I was protecting the family's interests. My father was old and vulnerable to she. Searched for the word and found the one she had been using in her own mind for years' manipulation. Clara's voice rose for the first time, not to a shout, not to anything theatrical, but higher than its natural register, pushed upward by the pressure of 3 decades of meals cooked and tables cleared, and hospital corridors walked and funerals attended, and holidays endured, and silence maintained. until silence had become her skeleton, the thing that held her upright while everything else was taken away. You called 37 years of cleaning your father's house and driving him to his appointments and sitting up all night outside your brother's hospital room. Manipulation. The word hung in the air like a struck bell. No one moved. Brandon's phone sat face down on the table, forgotten. Richard stared at the tablecloth. Ellen's hand had risen to her mouth. But in the reverberating silence after her own words, Clara felt something fracture inside her composure. Her hands trembled. She had to place the letter flat on the table and press both palms against it to keep the shaking from spreading to her arms, her shoulders, her voice. 37 years of being told she was no one condensed into a single tremor that ran through her body like current through a wire. For one terrible moment, she doubted everything, doubted Arthur. Doubted the letters, doubted whether the old man had truly seen her or had merely used her image as a mirror in which to examine his own regret. Raymond, sitting at the end of the table, caught her eye. He gave a nod so slight it could have been mistaken for a blink. But Clara received it the way a swimmer receives a hand extended from a dock, not as rescue but as confirmation that the shore existed and she was close to it. She exhaled. She steadied. And then the voice came from the other end of the table. Young, clear, quiet in the way that only sincerity is quiet. I remember Aunt Clara. Every head turned. Sophie Caldwell sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her. Her fair hair pulled back, her expression carrying none of the calculated neutrality that the rest of the family wore like armor. I remember when I was little, every time we came to Grandpa Arthur's house for holidays, Aunt Clara was the one who took me outside when the adults started arguing. She'd bring me to the garden and give me apple pie and tell me everything was going to be fine. She paused. Uncle Thomas wrote to my dad once that Sophie is like Clara. She notices things without being told. I didn't understand that when I was 6. I understand it now. Richard looked at his daughter with the startled expression of a man who has just heard his child speak in a language he did not know she had learned. Brandon's jaw tightened. Vivian stared at Sophie with an expression that combined betrayal and disbelief in equal volatile proportions. Clara opened the blue notebook. She had not planned to read from it. The notebook was private in a way that the letters and invoices were not private in the way that bones are private, the hidden infrastructure that holds the visible body upright. But Arthur had told her not to stay silent anymore, and silence, she now understood, was not the same as dignity. Sometimes dignity required noise. I never intended to read these lines in front of anyone, but Arthur knew this day would come. She turned through the pages, the careful columns of numbers, the categories of expenditure, the marginal notations in her own cramped handwriting, and read aloud the entries that had cost her the most to write. Postpone new glasses, $240. Request extra evening shift, Tuesday and Thursday. Sell gold bracelet, $650. The gold bracelet, the last physical object connecting her to Ruth Jennings. Her mother, who had died when Clara was 30, and left her nothing but that bracelet and a recipe for cornbread, and the conviction that a woman's worth was measured by what she gave, not what she kept. Clara had sold it to cover the gap between Thomas's hospital bill and Arthur's pipe replacement invoice, and she had never told anyone because the telling would have required admitting that the life she was living had consumed the last piece of the life she had come from. The room was no longer performing indifference. Richard had lowered his head, his tie hanging forward, his hands clasped between his knees. Ellen's eyes were wet. Even Brandon had gone still, his usual restlessness extinguished by something he did not have the vocabulary to name. Clara read the final passage, Arthur's words embedded in his letter, like a nail driven through the center of a plank. If after my death there are still people who think Clara is not family, simply because she does not carry the Caldwell name, then they should ask themselves what they have done all these years to deserve that name beyond inheriting it. The sentence landed and stayed, embedded in the wood of the table, the plaster of the walls, the bones of every person sitting in the room. It was the kind of sentence that does not require repetition, because it cannot be forgotten. Brandon shoved back from the table, the chair legs shrieking against the hardwood. All right, if you enjoy putting on a moral performance, go ahead. But you still won't be able to keep this house. Clara looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the exhausted clarity of a woman who has finally arrived at the place she was always walking toward. You're wrong. I don't need to hold this house the way you'd hold it as an investment, as a number on a spreadsheet. I only need to hold what belongs to me. And I have enough documentation to do exactly that. Brandon grabbed his keys and his phone and moved toward the door. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the glasses on the shelf and send a tremor through the old chandelier above the table. Vivian remained seated. The color had not returned to her face. She looked at Raymond, and when she spoke, her voice had lost all its architectural sweetness. What remained was the raw material beneath, exposed and cracked. What if we saw Raymond removed his glasses, held them to the light, and replaced them? A gesture that consumed 4 seconds and communicated absolute certainty. You have that right. But with what I've seen today, a valid will with medical certification, 12 years of tax payments, maintenance records, a drafted transfer agreement with your father's handwritten annotations, and a living witness to the power of attorney incident. Your chances in court are very low, and if this goes to litigation, every document on this table becomes part of the public record. Vivian understood. Clara could see the understanding arrive not as a single revelation, but as a cascade, each implication triggering the next. Public record meant the letters, the invoices, the power of attorney attempt. The story of a family that had treated a woman as invisible for 37 years while she paid their bills and kept their house standing. A courtroom would make all of it permanent, searchable, quotable. Vivian stood. She pushed a chair in against the table with precise, controlled force. Fine. If you want to keep it, keep it. But don't expect the family to have any responsibility for this house going forward. Clara folded the letter closed. From the beginning until now, responsibility has never belonged to the family. Vivian opened her mouth, closed it, turned and walked past Raymond without acknowledgement. Her heels clicking through the hallway with diminishing authority, each step slightly less certain than the one before. The others rose in sequence, Richard reaching for his coat, Ellen gathering her purse, the aunt collecting her things, the distant cousins moving toward the door, with the relieved haste of people escaping a building they suspected was on fire. No one mentioned the offer to buy the house. No one used the word help. Sophie was the last to stand. She walked around the table to where Clara stood beside the chair she had never sat in during the meal, and she put her arms around Clara briefly, fiercely, the way you hold someone when you are not sure you will see them again, but you want them to remember that you were there. If you need someone to help paint the front door, call me. Her voice was low, meant for Clara alone, and carried the specific weight of a promise made by someone old enough to understand what promises cost. Clara smiled. Not the careful, diminished smile of a woman performing gratitude. A real smile, the kind that uses muscles that have been dormant so long they ache when activated, the kind that changes the geometry of a face, and in doing so changes the person wearing it. Sophie left. The door closed softly behind her. The dining room settled into silence. Plates half finished. Water glasses marked with lip prints. Crumbs on the white tablecloth. And Raymond Keene still seated at the end of the table, his briefcase unopened beside his chair. He removed his glasses, wiped them with his handkerchief, and spoke without looking up. You handled that better than most people I've encountered in situations like this. Clara began stacking the plates. I only read what should have been read a long time ago. Raymond stood, reached into his briefcase, and produced a small envelope. Arthur set aside a house maintenance fund. It's not a large amount, but it's enough for the first repairs. He instructed me to deliver it only after everything in the house had become clear. Clara accepted the envelope. Thank you. Raymond buttoned his coat, picked up his briefcase, and paused at the dining room threshold. He looked back at the table, the wooden tray, the documents still arranged where Clara had placed them. The remains of a meal that had served a purpose entirely different from nourishment. and then he left without another word. Clara carried the dishes to the kitchen. She ran the hot water, waited for it to warm the old pipes reluctant to deliver, and washed each plate, each cup, each fork with the methodical patience of a woman who understood now that the cleaning was not servitude, but sovereignty. She was washing her own dishes in her own kitchen, in her own house. The afternoon light moved across the window above the sink, slow and amber, the October sun descending through a sky that had cleared without anyone noticing. She was drying the last glass when she heard footsteps on the path outside. A single pair of shoes moving slowly, stopping at the gate. Clara looked through the kitchen window. Vivian stood outside the fence alone. No Brandon, no handbag, just Vivian in her brown coat, one hand resting on the top rail of the leaning gate, looking at the house the way one looks at a photograph of a place that no longer exists. Clara dried her hands. She walked through the hallway, opened the front door, and stood on the porch. They regarded each other across 15 feet of brick path and dead leaves and 37 years of accumulated wreckage. The wind had died. The maple stood bare and enormous against the clearing sky, its branches tracing dark lines against the fading light. Vivian did not step through the gate. She stood with her hand on the wood, her fingers tracing a grain line. And when she spoke, the voice that emerged was one Clara had never heard before, stripped of its architecture, its strategy, its decades of carefully maintained superiority. What remained was thinner than Clara expected, older. My mother planted that maple. Her eyes moved to the tree and stayed there. She loved this house. Every fall she swept the porch herself, even when Dad told her to let the gardener do it. Clara stood on the top step, her hand resting on the porch column. The wood was cold through her sleeve. I know. I've watered that tree for 10 years, even the years nobody asked me to. Vivian stood motionless for several seconds. Her face carried no calculation, no contempt, no strategy. Only the expression of a woman who had just recognized something that had been present for a very long time, growing quietly in the yard of a house she had stopped visiting, tended by a person she had refused to see. She did not apologize. She did not offer reconciliation. She did not say anything else at all. She simply turned and walked back toward her car, and this time, for the first time, she did not slam anything. The gate closed behind her with a soft click, the metal latch settling into the catch, with a sound so quiet it could have been mistaken for permission. Clara watched the Mercedes pull away. The taillights glowed red for a moment at the end of Birch Hollow Road, then turned the corner and were gone. She went back inside. She retrieved the envelope Raymond had given her and carried it to the front porch. The wind had stilled completely. The last light of the day lay across the leaning fence, the leaf-covered path, and the bare branches of the maple like a benediction offered to no one in particular and accepted by everything it touched. She opened the envelope. Inside was a check, enough for the first repairs, and a small folded note on heavy paper written in Arthur's square, unwavering hand. Paint the front door again. Every house should begin at the place where people step inside. Clara folded the note and placed it with the check in the pocket of her cardigan. The old grey one with the frayed cuffs, the one she had worn to the reading of the will. The one she would probably wear until it fell apart, because it was the last piece of clothing she had bought while Thomas was still alive to see her in it. She stood up from the porch step. She walked down the 2 stairs along the brick path, stepping over the leaves instead of through them, and stopped at the gate. Birch Hollow Road stretched in both directions, empty and quiet in the way that New England roads are quiet in October. The stillness, not absence, but accumulation. The weight of every season that has passed over the same pavement, settling into the asphalt like memory into bone. She closed the gate. The latch caught with the same soft click Vivian's departure had made, and Clara noted this without commentary, because some symmetries do not require explanation. She walked back along the path and stopped in front of the door. The wood was grey where it had once been painted, the original color lost beneath years of weather and neglect. The surface was scarred with scratches and dents, the record of every hand that had ever pushed it open or pulled it shut. every boot that had kicked it in frustration, every child who had pressed a palm against it while reaching for the knob. The brass handle was worn smooth polished, not by intention, but by use the accumulated friction of a family passing through the same threshold for decades, leaving behind a residue of touch that no amount of weather could erase. Clara raised her hand and rested it flat against the wood. The surface was cold and rough beneath her palm, the grain raised by moisture, the paint flaking at the edges. She held it there for a long time, feeling the door. The way a doctor feels a pulse, not checking for something specific, but simply confirming that the thing beneath her hand was alive and real and present. Inside the house, the last light moved across the sitting room floor, touching the edge of the dining table, where the documents still lay arranged in their tray. The room held the aftermath of everything that had happened. The confrontation, the retreat, the single unexpected embrace, the quiet return of a woman who had come back not to fight, but to look at a tree her mother planted. All of it was present in the silence absorbed into the walls and floors and ceilings of a house that had witnessed generations of failure, and in the end, one improbable act of correction. There were no more voices, no manufactured laughter, no appraising glances measuring the distance between what a person was worth and what a person owned. Only the quiet remained, and a house that no longer carried any question about who it belonged to. Clara opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. The latch caught, the hinges settled, and the house on Birch Hollow Road, after all its years of waiting, was finally fully inhabited.